Hey, Larken Rose here. My last video was about resisting authoritarianism as opposed to obeying, and the fact that most people will look at the short-term risks and benefits and say, I'm not going to put myself at risk to disobey. And in the long term, everybody doing that and going along and obeying makes everything way, way worse. Well, a number of people commented saying something that I've said 80 gazillion billion times, but I don't think I emphasized it very much in that video, which is that as a practical matter, if you're resisting all by yourself, it'll accomplish either nothing or less than nothing. If you stand up and openly, I'm not going to do this, you're probably going to be overpowered and squashed. And you may even serve as an excuse for the control freaks to go, this is why we need more power and more surveillance and more armed thugs to force people to obey us. So the last video was about sort of the abstract philosophical thing of if you only take into account the very short-term risk benefit, and if everybody does that, then everybody goes along, because at each point in time, each person's going to say, well, I don't want to be the one to stick my head up and get it chopped off, so I'm going to go along. And that enables tyranny. Now, of course, there are practical considerations of when does resistance actually do any good. Now, there's a couple kinds of doing any good when it comes to resistance. Somebody who just does some work under the table and it doesn't get reported and is not getting taxed, all by itself as an isolated thing, that is doing some good, because it's not, that person isn't funding the machinery of authoritarian domination and warmongering and all that. So it's a tiny win. Now, zillions of people are still being robbed and there's still going to be a war machine. So it's a little tiny sort of deprivation of your lifeblood to empower the state to do evil crap. So it's really tiny when one person does it. Now, if a gajillion people do it at the same time, and the black market, where we don't report things to politicians, we don't pay tribute to them, when that becomes the whole market, all those tiny little things add up to, it will collapse any empire in the world if nobody complies. Now, I know that some people are going to chime in and say, yeah, but they could just print money, and that's sort of a different discussion. The feds can. State and local can't. If they get deprived of their funding, they fall apart a lot faster. And yeah, the feds can do that, but it's sort of a temporary fix, because it causes inflation and just annoys people even more. And so to some degree, they're not dependent on tax revenue per se, but it's still, that whole equation. Even I usually speak in simpler terms, like you pay taxes, they use it to fund war and stuff. But the fact that the supply of money isn't a set amount and they can magically make more appear, and that would cause inflation unless they then rob a bunch of people by way of taxation to reduce the amount of currency in circulation, which then acts against the inflationary influences. I'm not trying to get into that confusing mess. I mean, there's plenty of people who write about that, and it's worth understanding. But the idea of resistance in little ways can be little things that individuals do which take a tiny little chunk out of the state's power, or they can be examples of we're all the way going to break the back of this particular piece of authoritarianism. Like when it came to alcohol prohibition, there were already people hiding off in the woods with their whiskey distillery equipment, doing their thing, ignoring the state. Now, they weren't disempowering the state, they were just hiding somewhere and disobeying, which they had every right to do. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying that doesn't actually weaken the state. There are things that actually weaken the state. Now, nobody's obligated to martyr themselves and become a victim of authoritarianism while accomplishing nothing. So, and a lot of pro-freedom people don't even seem to grasp that. well, then why do you have a driver's license, or why do you do this, or why do you ever do anything that the people in power say? Because for each person, a lot of those things, disobeying would just mean more trouble for that person. The end. It's not a matter of I'm willing to put myself in danger to accomplish something greater. It's like it's not accomplishing anything greater. And sometimes just on principle, people say, I'm not going to go along with this, even if it keeps going, even if everybody else goes along with it, which is fine. But the point of resistance can be different for different people. Is the goal just to save you from robbery and domination, which is a perfectly worthwhile, valid, legitimate goal? Is somebody going, I'm going to smoke pot over here where nobody's looking, in some place where it's still illegal? Good. You exercised a freedom without the ruling class getting violent at you. Hopefully you get away with it. So that sort of, well, if this person can get away with disobeying, not in a way that attacks and harms somebody else, but just exercises their own self-ownership and doesn't get stomped on by the state. Okay, cool. State's still there. That didn't really do anything to dismantle or weaken the state. However, when 80 gajillion people all disobey and they do it openly, I've been to it was a while ago, a smoke down, is that what they called it, in Philadelphia, where a bunch of people came out and illegally smoked pot, out in the open. They said they were going to do it, and it was civil disobedience. Now, tactically speaking, you can argue that that's sort of you told them where you were going to be and invited them to do it. But the point of that wasn't to win the physical battle, obviously. They didn't show up to do battle. They showed up to make a point so that hopefully other people would go, yeah, in this day and age, it's a little bit bonkers for people to get dragged away at gunpoint for having pot. Really? So that's more of an approach. It's sort of like what Gandhi did, is we're going to do something. We're not going to overthrow the British Empire, but we're going to make them show themselves for what they are. And hopefully lots of people watching will say, that's horrible. That's really, really bad. And then at some point, Gandhi's approach was, if enough of us see this and say this is not okay, and we disobey, even without resisting, even the pacifist routine, which, as you all know, I'm not a pacifist. But even if everybody just says, we're not going along with this, we're going to go collect our own salt at the sea and stuff, and you can beat us up 80 gazillion times, and we're going to keep doing it until you give up. And it worked. Now, you can argue the morality of allowing yourself to be victimized as opposed to fighting back. Whatever. That's a different discussion for a different day. But the effectiveness of resistance depends first and foremost on how many people are doing it. If you get a one-person tax protest, well, you'll have one person in a cage, and everybody else going, what? Why did he do that? Well, he should have paid his fair share. But if you get enough people to actually come out and say, we're not going along with this, and you can't enforce it because a whole bunch of us, whether it's you just can't keep up with it, we're not even going to fight you. We're not even threatening mortal combat. We're just saying we're not stinking doing this. Good luck prosecuting it. And that's the civil disobedience thing, where lots of people are just we're going to disobey right in front of you, so many of us, that you can't do anything about it. Now, as for we're all going to go to where your cops are waiting and then do the civil disobedience and let them beat us up, that serves one purpose, to hopefully get spectators to go, that's horrible. But then there's just the civil disobedience of one example, people don't even view it as civil disobedience because it's not, almost nobody drives the speed limit. It's not enforceable because nobody does it. Almost everybody is 5, 10, 15 miles an hour over the speed limit. In Phoenix, they're 80 over the speed limit. And then the state troopers are going way faster than any of them. But when everybody just goes, we don't give a crap about that law. We'll stay in the general vicinity most of the time, maybe. They stop trying to enforce, hey, you were 1 mile an hour over the speed limit. Now, those little towns may still do their Roscoe P. Coltrane extortion racket of hiding somewhere and robbing people coming through going 1 mile an hour over the speed limit and stuff. But overall, it gets to the point where nobody's scared of driving 5 over the limit because they know they're not going to pull me over for 5 over the limit. Yeah, but you are over the limit. Like, technically, you're not supposed to do that. But everybody does, so you know nothing's going to happen to the people who do that. And that's true of any law. Like, if there was a law that said, no more private gun ownership, and 100 million American gun owners just said, we're not giving up ours. Yep, we're keeping ours. Go boop yourself. If they tried to enforce it and people had to resist, that's one thing. But before that, if they found out, 100 million people just told us we're not doing it, we probably shouldn't try to enforce that. Because if that many people don't feel obligated to comply with this demand, it's probably going to go really badly to try to enforce it, especially given that the demand is disarm yourselves. And what they did was not disarm themselves. So trying to enforce it on those people is rather logistically difficult, let's just say. But so the first thing that matters is the mentality of the people and the number of people who have that mentality. So we've seen things going on in Australia and the UK with the COVID circus, but there was plenty of stupid stuff before that, and victim disarmament, gun control that people went along with. And now there's the immigration fascists in the US. But over in the UK, it's pitiful. And I know some people who still live there and who are voluntarists. I know some people in Australia who live there and are voluntarists. But overall, the population in those places has been utterly pathetic, where they get stomped on and where it's, oh, well, we're going to harass you because you made a post on the internet saying something critical that we're going to call hate or say offended somebody or something. And the mentality of everybody going along with that, here's an important thing to understand, and it's really hard to tell the difference as an outside spectator. If you hear in the news, the cops showed up in the UK or wherever because somebody made a post and they called it misinformation or hate speech or some stupid thing, and they showed up, and here's the story, and here they are showing up to arrest the guy or harass him or question him or confiscate his computer or whatever it is they're doing, that might be a place where all that guy's neighbors are like, yeah, I'm glad that happened because you said something that offended somebody. Or it might be all his neighbors are like, oh, this is so bogus and ridiculous, but I don't want to be the one to stand up. And I don't want to be the one to resist and do anything about it. Now, those two scenarios can look exactly the same from the outside. Like, you see that little story of somebody being harassed, and I don't know what the hell his neighbors think about any of that. The difference is, if all his neighbors think, yeah, serves him right for saying something the government and the Ministry of Truth told him not to say, all right, doomed. That guy should probably move and run away and come to Arizona or something. There's more spirit of resistance here. I mean, obviously, it's still mostly statist, but there's pretty many people who at least at some point can say, screw you, I'm not doing what you tell me. But if you live in a population where most of the people side with the authoritarian thugs, like philosophically, you're kind of in trouble. Now, you can try really hard to change their minds. I'm all in favor of always trying that. But if there's a population of a whole bunch of people and they all think this sucks and this is bogus and this is ridiculous, but I don't want to get in trouble, at least that population has the potential to very quickly just turn on a dime and suddenly say, we're not going to do this. And it's a weird phenomenon. Somebody else commented about this on my last video, where a lot of people seem to require a William Wallace, that guy was saying. Somebody who goes, I'm not going to go along with this. Are you? Like, this is BS. And I'm going to stand up without waiting to see what anybody else is going to do. And I'm going to say, I'm not going along with this. I'm going to resist. And then often other people will join in and go, yeah, me too. Now, this seems to be like very hardwired into us. The Milgram experiments, most of you know what that is already. Basically, it was a test to see how much people will blindly obey orders even when they're obviously hurting an innocent human being. And the sad answer is most of the time people will totally do that because people are cowards who were trained to obey authority. But one of the main, I think it was literally the biggest factor in getting people to disobey orders and to actually resist. In that case, they didn't even have to like forcibly resist. They just had to say no and then not do something. It wasn't like they were under threat of violence if they disobeyed in those experiments. But the biggest factor by far is them seeing another person disobeying, which seems so simple and pathetic. But it's an experiment. You can look up all about it, and I've talked about it in other videos, where the person thinks he's pushing a button to zap somebody else. They pretend it's for like a memory experiment, but at some point the other person's like screaming in pain. It's, well, the experiment must go on. You must keep hitting buttons. But the thing, so the person's going along, and often people will be like stressed and I don't want to go on. Do I need to? Do I have to go on? Bzz, bzz, bzz. But the thing that made almost everybody stop immediately was somebody sitting right next to them in their position. Now, he was an actor, but somebody saying, this is wrong. I can't do this. I'm not doing this anymore. Almost everybody, when somebody next to them says that, immediately says, yeah, I'm not doing it either. I'm stopping too. This is wrong. It's like, you already knew it was wrong, right? You didn't need that guy to tell you. You just needed that guy to demonstrate that that's a thing you can do, is say, no, I'm not going to do that. Duh. Because we are so trained to be obedient dogs. All the indoctrination having to do with authority is to train us to be obedient dogs so that we feel really uncomfortable disobeying an authority figure. And I mean, I still remember feeling that subliminal psychological feeling even after I had become an anarchist. Like the idea of having no respect for cops, when I grew up a proper law-abiding, tax-paying conservative, I could still feel the trained-in thing of like, you're supposed to like obey them because you're a bad person if you don't. And that sort of gut level, feels level indoctrination gets deeper than the thinking stuff. So you can understand, yeah, this is bogus. They're just people with badges and costumes. They don't magically have different moral rights. How the hell would that happen? But there's still the training, the Pavlovian training of you're going to react instinctively, emotionally react a certain way because you were trained to. And a lot of people still do that. But the thing that breaks that is when somebody suddenly disobeys. Now, that doesn't at all mean that the disobedience is going to be moral or useful or rational or tactically anything that isn't stupid. So the concept of literally a riot, we're all really mad, let's go break stuff, is an example of a very not useful, not moral response to people being really mad at something. How dare those cops beat that guy up? Let's go trash the local liquor store. What? How the hell do you relate anything to anything? But it's as soon as people don't feel bound by, like, we have to obey. Now we don't. And this is the problem with people growing up to be trained dogs with no moral code and no philosophy, that when they decide to disobey, they're not, like, clear in their head, okay, what should we do and what shouldn't we do? It's like, well, now we're just wild animals because all we knew before was blind obedience. We've never actually thought about having a moral code and stuff. So the downside is that resistance often comes out as something stupid and counterproductive. And, oh, we're mad about this thing over here. Let's go stand in the highway and get in the way of a bunch of people trying to get to work. Well, are they the ones who did it? Well, no. We're raising awareness by basically kidnapping a bunch of people and holding them hostage. Well, then you suck. You're a crappy human being. That's not even the people who did it. Half of them probably don't even like what happened. And now you're just being a muddle-headed dumbass inconveniencing a bunch of people who had nothing to do with it, because you're like, we're going to go resist. And so often resistance comes out in a really stupid, ineffective way. And often it comes out in the form of, we're going to vote for a different master. Never learn, do ya? But the sort of resistance that actually does some good, the open kind, because there's I'm going to mind my own business here and like black market trade and, do things to basically replace the system, find a way to trade with your neighbors and stuff that you're not reporting anything, you're not paying anything, live your life, sort of build a network and a community outside of the control mechanism. And there's tons of people who are into that and describe a bunch of ways to do that. Derek Rose is one who's very much into that. There's a bunch of other people, but I'm not going to sit here trying to remembering all their names, where their focus is creating community and trade and communication and all these things to basically replace the version that we have now that has government tentacles and everything. And that's all awesome. That's great. The mentality has to come first. There have to be people willing to disobey. Like, you don't get black market trading unless all those people are like, screw the government. I don't care if they say I'm allowed to do this, or if I'm obligated to pay my fair share of the costs of blowing up people on the other side of the world. So the mentality has to come first. There's no solution. Like, there's no solution to slavery if the slaves think they're supposed to be slaves. If they know that they're not supposed to be slaves, then there's resistance, there's running away, there's sabotage, there's different things they can do. But if they're not actually trying to be free, they're not going to be free. And it's the same thing with people believing in government. If they feel morally obligated to obey government, there is no solution, which is why my entire focus is trying to change as many people's minds as possible. Now, there's lots of practical stuff to do after that, regardless of how many people you do or don't have on your side, understanding freedom and stuff. If you have everybody, you don't even have to do anything. Just ignore the state. If you have a few people, well, you have to be a little more strategic and careful and maybe quiet or maybe very active in one way or whatever. But so my last video was more about just the mentality and pointing out that people's self-preservation usually makes them behave like cowards. And I mean, I'm just describing how people are wired, myself included. There's lots of things like, do I really want this trouble right now to disobey some dumb little thing? And that's the practical side isn't just, it's not like it doesn't exist. It's real. So it really is a matter of, is disobedience right here and now, or maybe even resistance right here and now, is it worth anything? Will it do anything? Because if not, probably don't do that. Don't just martyr yourself for the sake of martyring yourself. I mean, in some cases, martyring yourself makes people notice and makes people, stand up and resist. Sometimes it just makes them go, well, that guy was stupid for martyring himself. So it depends what the outcome is, what you're trying to achieve, and whether it's going to do anything. So it's not that any resistance is good and effective and useful. Well, sadly, no, it isn't. But the mentality has to come first. And that's what my previous video was about, is having the mentality and understanding that if everybody is just looking at the here and now and the risk benefit right now to them, most people will go along with it forever. Now, the number of things, if you get even a significant minority of the people who actually believe in freedom and are ready to resist, there's so many things. A lot of them are illegal. I'm not going to describe them out loud here because some would consider that like telling people to break the law, which I'm all in favor of. I'm just not going to do it in front of a camera. Because there's tons of legal ways and illegal ways to put such a burden on the system that it starts to fall apart. And there's lots of illegal ways that are very low risk, and they're not violent confrontation. It's not having a shootout. It's just stuff that messes up their system. I mean, one thing that's not even illegal is if everybody who got a traffic citation took it to court, their system collapses. Doesn't even matter if you had a reason or an excuse or an argument or anything. They need the vast majority of people to just pay the tickets for the resources they have to keep up with the amount of extortion that the road pirates commit. If everyone just said, yeah, you have to take me to court and prove it. If everyone just did that, their entire traffic citation racket would collapse. Just completely fall apart. And that's all the way legal. Just say, not guilty, I'm going to show up for your stupid trial. Even if I just stand there and go, well, you have the burden of proof. Prove something, dumbass. And if everyone just did that, that entire system collapses. And there's things I've mentioned before. See how vague I can keep this. There are a gajillion, billion, zillion different ways that several million people could absolutely bury the IRS into oblivion. I mean, it's almost there already. By way of paperwork and putting a burden on them that isn't violent. Some of them are all the way dishonest. But justifiably dishonest. Like if 80 gazillion people, I'm not advising that you do this. If 80 million people filed tax returns with just made up names and made up numbers and made up stuff, and the IRS got like 80 million returns of just fictional people getting fictional income, the burden that would put on their system would just be massive. Now, if you had 80 million people, or even a fraction of that, ready to disobey and resist, there are other ways to do it that would work just as well. Anyway, even just something like, does this count as, yeah, this counts as legal. It's rude. It's funny, but I'm pretty sure it counts as legal. File your tax. If you're going to file your tax return, you're getting robbed. You like run a little business and you can't do it under the table and stuff. Oh, bastards are robbing me. Okay, I'm going to file this whole thing and pay whatever the lowest amount of extortion I can. But I'm going to leave off one deduction some business deduction of I spent $100 on a wheelbarrow or some damn thing. File the whole return, pay the whole thing, do the whole thing. And then a week later, file for a refund and go, whoops, I forgot that little, I forgot that one deduction. So I'm filing this amended return that you have to process all over again to give me my $3 back or whatever it is to do a refund. And the resources it takes for them to go through the process of issuing a refund, it isn't none. And the funny thing is, ages ago, it was some dumb little amount they alleged I owed. This was so long ago. And I looked up their procedures. And it was some stupid little amount. And I looked up their procedures, and there's a thing, not an offer in compromise. It's like a payment schedule plan. I forget what it's called. I haven't looked at that crap for so long. And it's like, okay, if I offer to pay this off in less than however many years on a monthly thing, like within these guidelines, you have to accept my offer. And it was something like, I'm going to give you $1.20 every month. And I know it costs them way more than that just to process it. So it's like, if you're going to harass me for, I don't even remember the $100 or $200 or whatever it was. It may have been even less than that. And it's just, okay, well then I'm going to pay that to you in it's an installment plan. In tiny little installments where every single one is costing you more than you're getting from me, because you have to go through all the stupid paperwork process. And I know in your procedures where you have to accept this because it's within certain guidelines. If it's below a certain amount and it's going to be paid off in a certain amount of time, they have to accept it. And I knew that, and I cited it. And so their demand for that little bit of money, I just decided to be spiteful and rude, cost them considerably more than they got from me, even though I paid it. Like, they got it, and also it created an even bigger burden on them. If just something like that, and again, I can't imagine, there can't be a law against that, of I filed all my taxes, but I didn't take one deduction. Like, well, you're not required to take a deduction. File all your stuff, do all your stuff, and then a week later, file a claim for refund and say, oh, I forgot this deduction I want $7 back or something and make them process that whole thing. Imagine 80 million people doing that. Make them do 80 million refunds of like $7 each. Like, they lose that little bit of money, but massive amounts of resources and and time and effort would have to be put into doing all that. And there's ruder ways to do it, and I've seen one thing. I don't know how true it is, but somebody who runs a business just so hated them that there's this meme out there. I don't know if it's true or not, that he would like make copies of just a bazillion business records and just deliver them in these giant just crates of just pallets of records in no particular order, all shuffled together, because it's not like they can say that there's a law that says it has to be a certain amount of organized. No, you just summoned my records. Here they are, you parasitic piece of crap. Good luck. And if people just did that, and I mean, a lot of people do that by accident just because they're disorganized and they're like, I got audited. I grab all my pile of just chaos. And, you know, people who run some little business, it's like manual labor, and it's like they're not doing all the proper bookkeeping, but they just have piles of receipts and crap. It's like, good, I'm going to go in with a pile of stuff and make this dumbass parasite of the state have to rummage through it for hours, even if I have to sit there and watch with them trying to figure it out. Okay, do that. Be as big a pain in their ass as you possibly can. So the point is, there's a whole big range of ways to resist, some of which are even legal, and you can do it openly right in their face. And if enough people, it still does it. It still breaks the system, all the way to people just forcibly resisting. Like, we're not going to go along with whatever this stupid law is. And if you come to arrest us or try to enforce it, we will defend ourselves by force if necessary. Like, there's a giant spectrum of ideas, or a spectrum of ways to resist. And it's a thing I've pondered writing about before. And even just, like in the case of the IRS, even just knowing their procedures, it would be, if 10 million people did it, it would be so easy to crash their entire system. Just like, oh, you say I owe you $23. I want an examination meeting in person and I'm going to record it. And they have to give you one. You go in and have a meeting, and afterwards you say, okay, I want to speak to your supervisor. And they have to bring him in. And then they say, you still owe us $23. Okay, I also have a certain number of days where I can ask for an appeals meeting with the appeals division of the IRS, another in-person meeting that I'm going to tell you I'm going to record, and then we're going to go in. They're going to talk to your supervisor, and then I'm going to appeal that. And eventually you get the 90-day letter, and you can appeal to tax court. I'm going to go do that. If everybody they said you owe $23 dragged them through that whole thing, which is just the due process that their system requires, that their system would grind to a, I mean, their system's almost ground to a halt as it is. It would just completely frickin' fall apart. And a lot of that is sort of no risk for the person. So there's the entire range of, like, I'm just going to give them a paperwork nightmare because screw them. All the way screw them, I'm not going to file, I'm not going to pay, I'm not doing anything. Which is just the risk versus the benefit in your mind of, and what line you're not going to cross, what level of compliance you're not going to do. And there's a personal level of that I try not to dictate to other people, like how much you're going to martyr yourself. Like, I'm going to stand up and die in a hail of gunfire. It's like, okay, you can. I'm not sure it's doing that much good. And if you decide not to die in a hail of gunfire, I'm not going to condemn you for it. And I know there's some pro-freedom people who are like, if you do anything, if you pay 3 cents in sales tax on a Snickers, you're the root of all evil and you're not a real anarchist. Or if you have a driver's license or you have a carry permit, if you go along with anything ever, instead of dying in a hail of gunfire, then you're not a real anarchist. Okay, but what does that accomplish? Like, the goal is to get to a free society, not just to martyr some people and then give the state an even bigger excuse to be thugs. But anyway, I could rant for 1 billion hours about the ways that people can resist, from just no risk to, well, I don't need to explain the ways that are all the way risk. You already know that. It's people disobeying and saying, we're not going along with this. If you show up with guns to arrest us, we'll show up with guns to shoot you. Like, American Revolution. That's one end of the spectrum. There's a whole lot of in-betweens that aren't that drastic and risky. But the thing that has to come first is always the mentality. If you're at least to the point where you're like tactically thinking, is this worth it or not? Instead of, oh, I just do as I'm told no matter what, because I don't want to get into any trouble. Like, that's, if the whole population thinks that, you're in trouble, because it's the ruling class is going to get away with doing whatever the hell they want. If your mentality is at least to the point where you're thinking, well, what level of resistance would do me any good? What level of risk is worth something that it might help accomplish? And when there are people enough people who are like-minded, then you can actually check and say, they're doing this stupid thing. If I show up to say, no, you're not, how many of you are going to be there? And that's now a thing that people can communicate so fast because we have the internet and stuff that you can actually find out instead of just being William Wallace and going, I'm going to go fight the British. Hopefully I'm not the only one. Like, you find out ahead of time. If I go just disobey whatever their stupid command this time is, who's with me? So, oh, by the way, I'm going to throw in this thing. I talked a little bit about their stupid real ID surveillance state bullshit, which, golly gee, it was enacted with Trump as president. So their conservatives wouldn't complain about it loudly because it was his Gestapo Barbie out there telling everybody to do it. Guess whether it really happened? You have to do this. What happens if you show up with a driver's license that doesn't say that? They say, you're supposed to have a real ID. Now come on through. As I said, because enough people, in that case, I think mostly it's just people didn't know about it. Their ignorance was to their benefit. If enough people just say, and I don't have one, I have an Arizona driver's license, I intentionally didn't get the real ID, because there's a place on the form. Most people are just sort of signing it to get out of the stupid DMV. But there's a place on the form to say, I don't want real ID, screw you, so I still don't have it. Now, I do have a passport, so that would be a backup plan anyway that I could have used. But yeah, people are going through with driver's license. They're saying, you're supposed to do this. Well, we didn't. Screw you. Okay, you can fly anyway. Because there was enough disobedience, even though a bunch of it was just accidental, that it couldn't be enforced. And I fully expect somebody somewhere, and I might have been that if they had actually tried it. The moment they tried to say you can't get on a plane without this federalized, centralized surveillance state bullshit, I suspect a bunch of people are going to sue the crap out of them and say, yeah, you can't really do that. And then it would go to court and be a big thing. But people just disobeying goes a long way, even dumb little paperwork stuff. So, and I know a bunch of pro-freedom people said, no, I got mine is real ID because I didn't have a choice. Most people did. Probably every state you did. They were just really, really quiet about it. And if you searched, do I have to get a real ID? All they would do is push the government propaganda on you. And then when you go in and see the form, you can say, nope, I don't want it. And it was as easy as that. I didn't have to put up a fight or have a shootout. Mine's not for real ID purposes because screw the surveillance state. So anyway, that's sort of it. If you live your life, you have a life to live, you have stuff to do. But if here and there you think, what little tiny ways can I screw with the system and be a burden on the system and break it in as many ways as possible at a level of risk, or zero risk, that is worth the possible benefit? And if you just get enough people to have that mentality, like, you don't have the right to rule us. Yeah, you have a bunch of thugs with guns who will mindlessly follow orders, but we're still going to do things to undermine and break it. It doesn't take that much for a lot of people to each do a little tiny bit and collapse entire empires. Yeehaw. Now, of course, the real thing that needs to collapse is humanity's belief in authority. Because when that's gone, none of this matters anymore. And there won't be the revolutions and going in circles, and here's a new ruling class. So this is just like to undermine a particular ruling class, but what really needs to be undermined is the cult superstition of authority because then we're done with all this crap forever. Yeehaw.